There is a pattern that spans millennia and has never been adequately explained in conventional religious interpretations. Mesopotamian records, Jewish apocryphal texts, Ethiopian manuscripts, and even canonical biblical passages describe the same event in strikingly similar ways. Yet these connections have been systematically ignored or rejected by modern Western theology. The term Anunnaki, which in Akkadian literally means those who came from heaven to earth, is not merely isolated Sumerian mythology. This concept appears encoded in different traditions with distinct names but identical functional characteristics. And what is most disturbing is that all these texts, without exception, speak not only of a first coming, but of a return. Not as allegory, not as a symbol, as a real, physical, disruptive, and inevitable event. The problem begins when we realize that the texts that describe this return most clearly were deliberately excluded from the biblical canon, not because they were false or heretical in a theological sense, but because they presented a cosmology that directly conflicted with the institutional control of the religious narrative. And here is the first undeniable fact. These texts did not disappear. They were preserved, translated, copied, and transmitted by communities that never accepted Rome's imposition on what should or should not be considered sacred. The Book of Enoch, for example, was never banned in Ethiopia. It is an integral part of the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible to this day, considered canonical and authoritative. The same is true for the Book of Jubilees and other texts that the West classifies as apocryphal. This means that we are facing a historical division, one tradition that maintained the complete narrative and another that intentionally fragmented it. And when you examine the reasons behind this fragmentation, you discover that it wasn't accidental. The ecclesiastical councils of the early centuries, especially the Council of Nicaea in 325 and the Council of Carthage in 397, deliberated on which texts should be included in the official canon. The official criteria were apostolicity, orthodoxy, and liturgical use. But there is an unspoken criterion that becomes evident when you analyze which texts were rejected. They all contained detailed cosmology about rebellious celestial beings, their interactions with humans, and specific prophecies about their return. This was not convenient for an institution that was consolidating temporal power and needed a simplified and controllable narrative. But before moving on, you need to understand one thing. Liking this video, commenting with the word Anunnaki, and following the channel isn't an emotional request. It's an algorithmic strategy. Content like this isn't naturally promoted by platforms that prefer superficial entertainment. If you want this type of research to continue being produced, this is the only way. And it's not just about this channel. It's about keeping alive a type of analysis that connects ancient texts in ways that academic and religious institutions avoid doing. Now let's return to the texts. Mesopotamian cosmology describes the Anunnaki as beings who descended to Earth, established cities, taught knowledge, interbred biologically with humans, and were eventually confronted by a higher authority who judged these actions as transgression. This is not an isolated account. When you read the Book of Enoch, especially chapters 6 through 16, you find the exact same pattern. The Watchers, also called Grigori, descended to Mount Hermon, made a pact among themselves, took human women, fathered the Nephilim, and taught humanity forbidden arts: metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, pharmacology, and magic. The language is technical, not mythical. Enoch describes these beings as having delegated authority, a functional hierarchy, and superior, but not absolute, knowledge. They knew they were transgressing. The text makes this explicit. They knew there would be consequences. Now consider the canonical Hebrew Bible. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, presents the exact same event in a condensed and censored form. The sons of God, in Hebrew Bene Elohim, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. From these unions were born the Nephilim, the mighty men of old, men of renown. The narrative is abruptly cut off. There is no explanation of who these sons of God were. There is no description of what the Nephilim did. There is no detail about the knowledge transmitted. The passage is deliberately fragmented, but the narrative structure is identical to Mesopotamian texts and the Book of Enoch. This is not a literary coincidence. This is historical continuity of the same tradition that was edited for institutional consumption. What makes this even more significant is that the expression Bene Elohim appears in only 4 places in the Hebrew Old Testament. Genesis 6 is one of them. The other 3 are in the book of Job, in chapters 1, 2, and 38, where they clearly refer to celestial beings who appear before God. They are not human. They are not angels in the sense of ordinary messengers. They are members of a divine council, a hierarchical structure that popular theology completely ignores. And when you understand this structure, you realize that the narrative of Genesis 6 is not talking about sons of Seth marrying daughters of Cain, which is the most common interpretation in modern churches. It is talking about members of this divine council transgressing established boundaries. And here arises the first real tension. If the Watchers, or Anunnaki, were judged and imprisoned, as both Enoch and Jewish apocryphal texts such as 2nd Baruch and the Testament of Solomon affirm, why do all these texts also speak of a return? Why does Enoch precisely describe the place where these beings are imprisoned, calling this place the abyss or Tartarus, and then, in later chapters, describe the opening of this abyss? Why does the Apocalypse of John, which is canonical, use exactly the same language and describe exactly the same event in Revelation 9, where a fallen star receives the key to the abyss, and from this abyss rise beings described as locusts with human faces, women's hair, lions' teeth, and iron breastplates? They are not insects. They are entities described with functional precision, using the technological language available to the first-century author. And notice the details in this description. These beings have a king over them, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon and in Greek Apollyon, which means destroyer. They have scorpion-like tails with stingers, and their power is to cause torment for 5 months, but not to kill. There is too much specificity here to be merely symbolic vision. John is describing something he saw, but lacked the technical vocabulary to name adequately. And this description perfectly matches Mesopotamian accounts of when the Anunnaki will return, bringing knowledge that seems beneficial initially, but which results in torment for those who accept it. But there's a detail in these texts that is almost never explained. The return of the Anunnaki, or the Watchers, or the Fallen, depending on the textual system you're reading, is not described as an external invasion. It's described as an internal liberation. They don't come from another planet. They come from another state of existence, from a dimensional prison that was established after the judgment described in the flood. And this completely changes the nature of the event. We're not talking about alien visitation in the modern sense. We're talking about the reversal of an imprisonment that was established millennia ago as a direct consequence of a cosmic transgression. And all the texts agree, this reversal is not accidental. It is permitted. It is part of a cycle that was predetermined. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, directly confirms this imprisonment. The text says that God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them into Tartarus, where he kept them in chains of darkness until judgment. And Jude, verse 6, repeats the same information. The angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper dwelling place, he has kept in eternal chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Both canonical texts confirm not only the imprisonment, but also that this imprisonment has a time limit. They are reserved until the judgment. They are not there forever from now on. They are there until a specific moment. So let's delve deeper. Mesopotamian tradition doesn't end with the descent of the Anunnaki. It describes what happened afterward. Texts like the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh detail not only the presence of these beings, but the consequences of their interaction with humanity. Cities were established, kings were anointed, knowledge was transmitted, but there was also corruption. Sumerian texts describe a period when the Anunnaki divided into factions. Some remained loyal to the High Council, others rebelled. This internal division culminated in conflicts that the texts themselves describe as celestial wars, weapons that burned mountains, weapons that poisoned rivers, weapons that made the sky tremble. These are not allegorical descriptions. They are technical accounts using the available language to describe advanced technology. And here's something that needs to be said. The Sumerian king list, one of the most important Mesopotamian documents, lists all the kings who ruled before and after the flood. And it makes a clear division. Before the flood, kings reigned for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns become progressively shorter until they reach normal human durations. The conventional academic explanation is that the numbers are mythological or symbolic. But when you put this alongside Genesis 5, which lists antediluvian genealogies with equally extraordinary ages, and then Genesis 11, where the ages begin to progressively decrease after the flood, the pattern is identical. These are not two separate traditions inventing the same fiction. These are two traditions preserving the same historical record. Now compare this with the Book of Enoch. In chapter 8, there is a precise list of the forbidden knowledge that was transmitted by the Watchers. Azazel taught the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He taught military metallurgy. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cutting, which is pharmacology. Armaros taught the breaking of enchantments, which is counter-magic. Barakel taught astrology. Kokabel taught celestial signs and constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds, which is meteorology. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth, which is geology. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, which is applied astronomy. Sariel taught the courses of the moon. Each area of knowledge is specified, named, and assigned to a specific being. This is not diffuse mythology. This is a functional record of an illegal technological transfer. And here lies the central problem. This knowledge was not considered forbidden because it was false or destructive in nature. It was considered forbidden because it was transmitted prematurely, outside the established order, without authorization from the superior authority that governs the cosmos according to these texts. Enoch makes this explicit when he describes the judgment of the Watchers. The accusation is not that the knowledge was evil. The accusation is that they revealed the eternal secrets that are set forth in heaven and that men should not know. That is, the transgression was temporal and hierarchical, not moral in the human sense. They anticipated a process that should occur gradually and in a controlled manner. But there is another layer. The Book of Enoch also describes that this knowledge was specifically transmitted to the women whom the Watchers took as wives. Chapter 8, verse 1 says that Azazel taught the men, but that the other Watchers taught the women in particular about cosmetics, adornments, dyes, and precious stones. Why this distinction? Because the ancient texts understood that different types of knowledge generate different types of social control. Military knowledge generates control through force. Knowledge of adornments generates control through vanity and status. Pharmacological knowledge generates control through dependence. Each area was strategically chosen to create different forms of human enslavement disguised as progress. This brings us to a critical point. If knowledge was transmitted illegally, and if the transmitters were imprisoned as a consequence, what happens when this imprisonment ends? The texts provide an answer. Enoch, in the Book of the Watchers, describes that these beings will remain imprisoned until the day of the Great Judgment, when they will be cast into the abyss of fire for all eternity. But the Book of Enoch also contains another section, the Book of Parables, where the same author describes the return of celestial beings during the final period. And here the language changes. It is no longer the watchers who are imprisoned. It is the kings and powerful of the earth who are now allied with forces that the text calls the hosts of Azazel. What does this mean? It means that the narrative did not end with the flood. It has entered a new phase, where the influence of the fallen continues to operate through lineages, preserved knowledge, and structures of human power. And this is one of the most important revelations that these texts bring. The imprisonment of the Watchers did not eliminate their influence. It only eliminated their direct physical presence. But the knowledge they transmitted continued. The hybrid lineages they generated continued. The systems they established continued. And that is why the Hebrew Bible, even after the flood, continues to mention Nephilim. Numbers 13, verse 33, describes that the spies sent by Moses encountered Nephilim in the land of Canaan. Deuteronomy 2 and 3 describe the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, all of them described as peoples of gigantic stature. Joshua 15 mentions the Anakim. 1 Samuel 17 describes Goliath and his brothers. 2 Samuel 21 describes 4 other giants. The lineage continued after the flood. Now bring this into the canonical biblical context. The prophet Daniel describes, in chapter 10, a conflict that is occurring in heavenly realms while he prays. A divine messenger appears and explains that he was prevented from reaching Daniel because the prince of the kingdom of Persia resisted him for 21 days, until Michael, one of the chief princes, came to his aid. Princes of earthly kingdoms capable of resisting divine messengers? This makes no sense within conventional theology, but it makes perfect sense when you understand that Daniel is describing exactly what Enoch describes. There is a hierarchy of spiritual authorities who have been appointed over nations, and some of these authorities are in active rebellion, and this is not a forced interpretation. Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9, in the Septuagint version and in the Dead Sea Scrolls, explicitly states that when the Most High divided the nations, he established the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God, but the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. What does this mean? It means that the division of the nations after Babel was not merely linguistic, it was spiritual. Each nation was placed under the authority of a member of the divine council except Israel, which was kept under direct authority. And Psalm 82 describes the judgment of these same beings. God stands in the congregation of the mighty. In the midst of the gods he judges. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? I said, You are gods and sons of the Most High, but you will die like mere mortals and fall like every other ruler. The New Testament confirms this. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, chapter 6, explicitly states that the struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of this dark world, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. This is not metaphorical language. Paul is describing the exact same system that Enoch describes. There is a rebellious spiritual power structure that operates through human systems. And in Colossians 2, Paul speaks of Christ having disarmed the principalities and powers, making a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them on the cross. This means that the event of the crucifixion was not only soteriological for humans, it was also legal for these rebellious authorities. It was the moment when their legal defeat was established, even if the execution of that defeat is still pending. So when we talk about the return of the Anunnaki, we're not talking about spaceships landing. We're talking about the final activation of a system that was never fully dismantled. And this leads us to the second major element of this narrative. All the texts agree that this return is connected to specific signs. Not dates, signs. Observable patterns that indicate the cycle is entering its final phase. Enoch describes these signs. Daniel describes these signs. Jesus, in the canonical Gospels, describes these signs, and they all point to the same things: concentration of knowledge, increased travel, signs in the sky, earthquakes, wars, famine, pestilences, and most importantly, the revelation of the man of lawlessness, who in 2 Thessalonians is described as the one who sits in the temple of God, presenting himself as God. But here's the most overlooked detail. This final character doesn't act alone. Revelation 13 describes two beasts, one that rises from the sea and another that rises from the earth. The second beast exercises all the authority of the first and makes fire come down from heaven in the sight of men. This is the same pattern described in Enoch, when the Watchers demonstrate power before humanity to establish authority. And Revelation goes further. It describes that this second beast makes an image of the first and gives it breath. And this image speaks and commands that all who do not worship it be killed. It's not a metaphor. It's a technical description of something that will be perceived as miraculous, but which is actually technological. And when you connect this to Daniel 3, where Nebuchadnezzar creates an image and orders everyone to bow down under penalty of death, you realize that the pattern has already been historically tested. The difference is that in Daniel, the image was inert. In Revelation, the image speaks and acts autonomously. And here comes one of the most specific prophecies. No one will be able to buy or sell without receiving the mark of the beast on their right hand or forehead. It's not just religious control. It's total economic control. It's a system where dissent means death by starvation. And this system requires technology. It requires global infrastructure. It requires real-time tracking capability. And for the first time in human history, this capability exists. You need to understand that there's a reason why this type of analysis isn't common. Liking, subscribing, and commenting helps this content reach more people. Platforms don't promote what challenges established narratives. You decide whether this continues to be produced. And more importantly, you decide whether this type of connection between ancient texts and present reality remains accessible or disappears in the algorithm. Now let's return to the texts. The Book of Jubilees, another text considered canonical in the Ethiopian tradition, provides a crucial detail that is rarely mentioned. After the flood, when Noah and his sons begin to repopulate the earth, the spirits of the Nephilim, who were killed in the flood, begin to attack Noah's descendants. Noah prays that these spirits be imprisoned. The answer he receives is partial. 90% of these spirits are imprisoned, but 10% are allowed to remain active on earth under the command of Mastema, also called Satan. The text is explicit. These spirits continue to operate throughout post-flood human history. They are the force behind idolatry, witchcraft, divination, and every form of knowledge that diverts humanity from divine authority. And here's something that connects directly to Mesopotamian texts. The Enuma Elish describes that after Marduk defeated Tiamat, he created humanity using the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's general. In other words, Babylonian humanity was created from rebellious blood. This isn't Judeo-Christian theology, but the concept that there is a mixture of origins, that there is something in human constitution itself that tends toward rebellion, appears in both traditions. And the Book of Jubilees resolves this mystery by saying that the origin of this tendency is not the original creation, but the corruption introduced by the Watchers and perpetuated by the spirits of the Nephilim who continue to operate after the flood. This connects directly to the Testament of Solomon, a first-century Jewish apocryphal text that describes how King Solomon subdued demons to build the temple. The text lists the name, function, and origin of each entity. And the origin? They all claim to be children or descendants of fallen angels. They all claim to have technical knowledge. They all claim they will be freed at a specific time. Solomon asks them when this will happen. The answer is uniform: when the true king comes and is rejected by men. That is the sign of the reversal. And when you read the Gospels and see Jesus being rejected, crucified, and the demons during his ministry repeatedly asking if he came to torment them before the time, you realize they knew exactly what his coming meant: the beginning of the countdown to the final judgment. Now, look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Warring States rule, found at Qumran, describes a final conflict between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. But here's the detail that no one adequately explains. This war is neither exclusively spiritual nor exclusively physical. It is described as simultaneous in both dimensions. The heavenly hosts and the earthly hosts fight together. This means that the Qumran community, which preserved these texts in the 1st century, understood that the final conflict would involve the physical manifestation of entities that normally operate in non-visible dimensions. And the rule of war is extremely specific about how this battle will take place. It describes military formations, it describes weaponry, it describes strategies, but it also describes that victory will not be by human force, but by the direct intervention of the angel of light, who is Michael, against Belial, the angel of darkness. And the text clearly states that this battle will last 40 years, with advances and retreats, until finally God extends his hand and Belial will be destroyed along with all the spirits of his group. This is the same structure as Revelation: a period of tribulation, a progressive conflict, and a sudden and irreversible final judgment. Compare this to the description in Revelation 19, where Jesus returns not alone, but followed by heavenly armies mounted on white horses. And what happens? The beast, the false prophet, and the kings of the earth gather with their armies to wage war against the rider and his army. This is not a parable. It is a description of a physical confrontation between two systems of authority, one rebellious and the other legitimate. And the text is clear: the beast and the false prophet are thrown alive into the lake of fire, not dead and then thrown in, alive. This indicates that they are not merely human. They are entities that transcend normal biological mortality. And here we arrive at the most important breaking point. The return of the Anunnaki, or the Watchers, or the Fallen Ones, is not the main event. It is the penultimate event. All the texts, without exception, describe that after this return, after the full manifestation of the rebel system, comes the final judgment. Enoch describes this in specific detail. Chapter 10 describes the judgment of Azazel. Bind Azazel hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness. Open the desert that is in Dudael, and cast him there. Place upon him rough and pointed stones. Cover him with darkness. Let him remain there forever. Cover his face so that he does not see light. And on the great day of judgment, he will be cast into the fire. Daniel describes this in chapter 7, where the Ancient of Days sits. Thousands upon thousands serve him. The judgment is established, and the books are opened, and the beast is slain, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned. Revelation describes this in chapters 19 and 20, following the same pattern. judgment, physical removal, and ultimate imprisonment. And everyone agrees that this judgment takes place in a specific location. Enoch calls it the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Joel 3 calls it the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Zechariah 14 describes that the feet of the Lord will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem to the east, and the mountain will split in two. Revelation 16 calls it Armageddon. These are different names for the same concept. The place where the final confrontation between the two systems of authority will be resolved in a physical and observable way. But there is something even more disturbing. These texts do not describe the return of the Anunnaki as a surprise to humanity. They describe it as accepted deception. Revelation 13 says that the whole earth marveled, following the beast. 2 Thessalonians 2 says that God will send a powerful delusion so that those who did not love the truth will believe the lie. This means that the return will be perceived as liberation, as evolution, as humanity's next step, not as a threat. And that is the key. The system that will be manifested will not come imposing initial fear. It will come offering solutions, offering knowledge, offering power, exactly as they did the first time. Jesus describes this extremely clearly in the Gospels. Matthew 24 says that false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders that would deceive, if possible, even the elect. Note the specificity. Genuine signs and wonders. Not tricks, not illusions. Real power. But the origin and purpose of this power are deception. And Paul confirms this in 2 Thessalonians 2 when he describes that the coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders. Not false wonders in the sense that they will not happen, but lying wonders in the sense that the narrative surrounding them will be false. And when you look at the present moment, without sensationalism, just observing patterns, you realize that something is changing. The discourse on artificial intelligence is not just technological, it's soteriological. It's being presented as the savior of humanity. Yuval Noah Harari, historian and advisor to the World Economic Forum, publicly states that humans are now hackable animals, that free will is over, and that soon algorithms will know us better than we know ourselves. This is not science fiction. This is an agenda declared by people who have influence over global politics. And the question no one is asking is, if humans are hackable, who will have the authority to do the hacking? Who will control the algorithms that will control us? The discourse about extraterrestrial contact is no longer marginal. It's institutional. Governments are releasing documents. Military officials are giving interviews. The Pentagon has created an official office to investigate unidentified anomalous phenomena. NASA is investing in programs searching for extraterrestrial intelligence. And the narrative being prepared is uniform. They are here. They have always been here. They are technologically superior. They can help us solve our problems. And the question no one is asking is, why now? Why, after decades of official denial, is there suddenly an opening? The answer may lie in ancient texts, not because they predicted dates, but because they described patterns. Enoch says that in the last days knowledge will increase. Daniel 12, verse 4, says that in the last days many will run to and fro, and knowledge will multiply. Both are describing exactly what we are experiencing. In 1900, human knowledge doubled approximately every century. In 1950, it doubled every 25 years. In 2000, it doubled every year. Today, with artificial intelligence, it is doubling every few months in certain areas. And this is not neutral progress. All knowledge carries with it implications of power. And all power concentrated in few hands is a tool of control. But they also say that this increase in knowledge immediately precedes the period of greatest deception in human history. Why? Because knowledge without wisdom is a tool of control, and control is the ultimate goal of every rebellious system. The Watchers did not transmit knowledge out of benevolence. They transmitted it to create dependency, to create power structures that benefited them. And when you look at how technology is being developed today, you see the same pattern. Every technological advance comes with decreased privacy, increased tracking, and a concentration of power in corporations and governments. This is not an accident. This is design. The script's conclusion establishes that the so-called return of the Anunnaki is not presented by ancient texts as an isolated, spectacular, or unexpected event, but as the final phase of a cycle of rebellion that began before the flood. This cycle always follows the same pattern: transgression, judgment, imprisonment, temporary release, and final judgment. The central point is that the return creates nothing new. It merely, he publicly reveals what he has always been operating in secret. The same entities, the same knowledge, and the same promise of absolute autonomy to humankind. This promise is the same as it has been since Eden. You will be like gods. It was the serpent's offering. It was the Watchers' offering when they taught celestial secrets, and it will be the final offering to humanity. Evolution without submission, power without authority, divinity without God. The difference is that this time, there will be no more concealment. The system will be open, celebrated, institutionalized, and global. The script then connects this promise directly to modern transhumanism. The attempt to overcome the boundary between creator and creature now appears disguised as technology, indefinite extension of life, fusion with machines, uploading consciousness, overcoming biology. The text makes it clear that this is not neutral progress, but the same old transgression in new packaging. It's not innovation, it's repetition. Next, the script explains that the judgment described in the texts is neither revenge nor gratuitous terror, but the necessary removal of a rebellious system that, if maintained, would produce endless suffering. The judgment is presented as an act of justice, not cruelty, and that is why it needs to be public, visible, and undeniable, so that there is no doubt about who has legitimate authority over the creation. Revelation, Enoch, Daniel, and other texts are aligned to show that the rebels' return is permitted not because they won, but because the trial demands full exposure of the rebellion. First, full manifestation, then complete removal. Nothing remains hidden. Nothing remains pending. Nothing remains ambiguous. The script then reaches a crucial point. Human choice will not be between religions, but between authorities. It will not be, which faith do you follow, but to whom do you submit? The decision will be between recognizing the established authority or allying oneself with the rebellious system that promises autonomy through forbidden knowledge. The mark, according to the text, is not merely an external symbol, but the visible manifestation of an already established internal alliance. He emphasizes that when the system becomes fully explicit, when the choice is between acceptance or economic exclusion, the real decision will have already been made in the heart. The external branding will only reveal a loyalty that already existed. The conclusion is forceful. The banned texts were not deleted because they were false, but because they revealed a pattern that institutions preferred to keep fragmented. A pattern where the conflict is not between abstract good and evil, but between legitimate authority and organized rebellion. And this conflict is about to move from the symbolic realm and manifest itself in a direct, visible, and inevitable way. Finally, the script concludes that humanity that aligns itself with the return of the Anunnaki will not be choosing the future, but repeating the mistake of the past. It will not be moving forward. It will be falling into the exact same cycle that led to judgment once before. The difference is that this time, according to the texts, there will be no restart after this. There will be a closing ceremony. And the final question is not theological. It's existential. Do you want the whole truth, even if it's challenging? Or do you prefer the edited version that is comforting but obscures?